The world below was a swirl of cloud and color, turning slowly in the dark. Outside the window, there was no sound, only the hum of machinery and the quiet rhythm of a human heart suspended between Earth and eternity. He had spent his life chasing the stars, designing the engines that could pierce the sky, mastering the numbers that made flight possible. Yet at this height, surrounded by the cold geometry of space, all those numbers suddenly felt small. Through the glass, he saw the curve of the planet glowing blue against the black. Cities flickered like embers, oceans shimmered with silver light. In that breathtaking stillness, he felt something move, something that had nothing to do with science. It was not a discovery, but a presence, a whisper that seemed to rise from the earth itself, quiet but unmistakable. You are not alone. Michael Hopkins had always believed that meaning could be measured. For years, he had trusted equations more than prayers, procedures more than mysteries. But here, 250 miles above everything familiar, his certainties began to dissolve. He wasn't running an experiment or collecting data. He was witnessing creation itself, alive and fragile beneath his hands. The instruments around him blinked in green and amber, the same lights that guided every mission since the dawn of the space age. But he realized that no instrument could measure awe. No sensor could record the feeling of gazing upon the world as God might see it whole, borderless, impossibly beautiful. He floated there for a long time, weightless yet grounded, listening to the quiet voice within that science had never taught him to hear. It was not the roar of rockets or the applause of mission control. It was a call, soft and steady, inviting him to look beyond the stars. He studied to the heaven that made them shine. He didn't know it yet, but this moment, the silence above the world, was where his true journey would begin. Long before he touched the stars, Michael Hopkins was a boy with dirt on his hands and wonder in his eyes. He grew up in Missouri, where the skies seemed endless and the nights were full of quiet constellations. While most children wished on stars, he wanted to understand them. He would lie on his back in the grass, tracing the slow movements of satellites overhead, whispering numbers under his breath. Speed, distance, orbit. It wasn't magic to him, it was math. And math, he thought, was the language of truth. He carried that belief with him into adulthood. At the University of Illinois, he studied aerospace engineering and learned how to turn equations into flight paths. Every calculation brought him closer to the sky. He saw beauty in symmetry, meaning in order. When professors spoke about chaos, he preferred to think in terms of control. The universe, in his eyes, was a grand machine, elegant, predictable, precise. Faith, however, never fit into that framework. He respected religion the way an engineer respects art, as something emotional, even beautiful, but not measurable. He believed in gravity, not grace. He trusted trajectory, not prayer. As he rose through the Air Force, and later when NASA accepted him into its astronaut corps, that confidence only deepened. He was trained to think in procedures, checklists, and simulations. Everything in his world had to be proven before it could be believed. If a system failed, you fixed it. If a mystery appeared, you studied it until it wasn't a mystery anymore. And yet, there were cracks in the armor. He wouldn't have admitted it then, but sometimes alone in the quiet of the cockpit, or walking home under the night sky, he felt a strange hollowness. He had reached everything he had set out to achieve. Success, recognition, the dream job millions would envy. But in the silence after each achievement, a question always lingered. Is this all there is? He had seen the precision of rockets, the triumph of human reason, the elegance of physical law, yet none of it explained why the human heart longed for something beyond them. He brushed the thought aside. Astronauts didn't dwell on philosophy. There was always another test, another mission, another challenge to solve. Still, in the background of his mind, the question never quite went away. It followed him through the hum of engines and the quiet corridors of NASA's training centers. And though he couldn't name it then, what he was feeling wasn't doubt, it was invitation. A gentle pull toward a kind of truth no formula could capture. He had conquered gravity, but not the emptiness it left behind. Soon, that emptiness would lead him to a discovery greater than anything science could measure. His wife, Julie, and their 2 sons were Catholic. They prayed before meals, attended Sunday Mass, and spoke about God with a gentle certainty he couldn't quite understand. He admired it, the calm, the simplicity, but he stood at the edges of their faith, like a guest at someone else's celebration. He often joined them at church, sitting silently beside them as hymns rose through stained glass. He didn't mock belief, but it felt distant, like a language he'd never learned to speak. Still, something in that stillness touched him. When the congregation knelt in prayer, the entire world seemed to slow down. It reminded him of space, that same weightless hush, where words fail and only wonder remains. At NASA, his days were filled with data. He trained for emergencies no one ever wanted to face. Oxygen leaks, fires, collisions. Every scenario was mapped and memorized until reaction became instinct. But no simulation could prepare the mind for the sheer scale of what they were trying to do, to send fragile human beings into the void and trust they would return. He began to realize how thin the line was between mastery and surrender. Late at night, he would step outside his house, look up at the stars, and feel that same contradiction. Pride and awe, control and humility. He'd whisper to himself, "We're really up there, tiny sparks in a sea of darkness." And then another thought would follow, softer and more persistent. If all this is real, why does it exist at all? For a man of science, that was the beginning of a dangerous question. The more he thought about it, the less the universe looked like a random accident. The laws he had spent his life studying, gravity, motion, thermodynamics, were too precise, too elegant. They didn't feel like coincidence. They felt like intention. He didn't tell anyone, not even Julie. But something inside him had shifted. He began reading articles and books about the intersection of faith and science, the writings of Catholic thinkers, stories of scientists who believed not despite their reason, but because of it. He started to pray in secret, not knowing if he was doing it right. A quiet whisper, "If you're real, show me." He didn't see a flash of light or hear a voice. And for a man trained to calculate everything, that peace was the most unfamiliar discovery of all. The closer the mission drew, the heavier the silence became. Each day of training was a reminder of risk, of how thin the boundary was between courage and disaster. Every time he suited up, he thought of his family, of the prayers whispered at the dinner table, of the calm he had always envied in them. Somehow, as the countdown to launch approached, faith no longer seemed like a distant idea. It began to feel like something he needed. He started speaking with one of NASA's chaplains, a quiet priest who understood both science and soul. Their meetings were simple, just 2 men talking in the break room after long days. Hopkins asked questions no textbook could answer. How can you prove God exists? What if faith is just comfort? Why does belief matter when you already have purpose? The priest never argued with him. He only smiled and said, "You already believe in order, don't you? Then maybe all that order points somewhere." That single sentence stayed with him. For the first time, Hopkins allowed the possibility that everything he admired about the universe, its symmetry, its laws, Its beauty might be evidence of a mind greater than his own. He began attending RCA classes, the Catholic Church's program for adult conversion. He studied the scriptures, learned the structure of the Mass, and reflected on the meaning of the Eucharist. Each step felt less like a leap of faith and more like the logical next move in a design he hadn't seen before. He didn't understand everything he read, but he understood the feeling it gave him: peace, belonging, a sense that truth wasn't a formula to solve, but a presence to encounter. One evening, during confession, he said something that surprised even him. "I've spent my whole life studying the heavens. Maybe it's time I start listening to heaven." That night, he made the decision. He would be received into the Catholic Church before his mission, and he wanted to take his newfound faith with him all the way into orbit. With special permission from his pastor and NASA's safety team, Hopkins was allowed to bring a small container of consecrated hosts aboard the International Space Station. Each host was divided into tiny fragments, enough for him to receive Holy Communion every Sunday during his time in orbit. He carried them carefully, sealed and blessed. Among his personal items, a family photo, a few mementos, and now the body of Christ. It was a gesture that seemed almost impossible, a sacred mystery traveling beyond the atmosphere, the Creator accompanying his creation into space. As Hopkins prepared for launch, his heart was no longer divided between logic and faith. He finally understood that they had never been enemies. They had been searching for each other all along. And when he stood beneath the rocket on that cold September morning, he whispered a prayer that wasn't scientific at all. "Lord, I'm ready. Take me wherever you want me to go." The rocket came alive with a sound that no words could contain, a roar that shook the bones and made the earth itself seem to tremble. As fire lit the sky, the engines pressed him into his seat, his heartbeat syncing with the thunder that carried him upward. For 9 minutes, there was nothing but vibration and flame. Then, as suddenly as it began, the engines cut off. Silence, weightlessness. Through a small circular window, Michael Hopkins saw what he had spent his whole life chasing, and yet nothing could have prepared him for the sight. Earth, a living jewel suspended in darkness, wrapped in blue light and cloud. No borders, no noise, only beauty beyond comprehension. He stared for minutes, speechless. He later said that in that instant, it was as if every question he had ever asked was suddenly answered not with logic, but with love. He didn't need proof anymore. The proof was right before his eyes. 16 sunrises and 16 sunsets each day, each one a sermon in color. But when the work was done, he would drift toward the Cupola, the station's great glass dome, and watch the world roll quietly beneath him. He thought of his family, his home, and the countless people who would never see what he was seeing. In that vast silence, he felt small, but not insignificant. It was the kind of humility that doesn't diminish a man, it elevates him. For the first time, he realized that science could describe how the stars moved, but not why they shined. And so, one quiet evening, while the others slept, he opened the small gold container he had brought from Earth. Inside were the consecrated hosts, fragile, weightless fragments of heaven. He floated before the window, watching the planet spin silently below, and whispered the ancient words of faith. "Lord, I am not worthy that you should enter under my roof." He closed his eyes, and in that moment, everything else disappeared: the instruments, the noise, even gravity itself. There was only peace. Peace so deep it seemed to fill the whole station. Peace that didn't come from earth or science or understanding, but from the quiet presence of God himself. When he opened his eyes again, the earth was glowing in sunrise. Golden light poured across the atmosphere, turning clouds into rivers of fire. He said later, "It felt like I was standing at the edge of heaven." That was his heavenly vision, not a miracle in the traditional sense, but a revelation, an encounter between human limitation and divine perfection. A moment when the universe stopped feeling like a machine and started feeling like a masterpiece. He floated in silence, held the Eucharist close, and prayed for the world below. He prayed for peace, for forgiveness, for the courage to live with the same clarity he felt in that moment of stillness. The scientist who had once trusted only numbers now trusted in mystery. The engineer who had built rockets now believed in grace. And the man who had sought the stars had finally found the light that created them. As the station continued its orbit, Hopkins gazed at Earth once more. He thought of how small it was, and yet how full of life, color, and love. He realized that maybe heaven was not far away at all. Maybe it had always been just beyond the veil of sight, waiting for someone to look up and recognize it. He whispered one last prayer before closing the window. "Thank you for letting me see what you see." After 166 days in orbit, the call came. It was time to come home. Hopkins strapped himself into the Soyuz capsule and took one last look at the window. The planet turned slowly below, glowing like a candle in the darkness. He thought of how far he had come, not just in distance, but in soul. He whispered a final prayer, not for safety, but for gratitude. Then came the fire. The capsule hit the upper atmosphere at nearly 17,000 miles per hour. The air outside ignited, wrapping the spacecraft in flames. Inside, the vibration was violent, relentless, like being shaken inside the hand of God. He gripped the edges of his seat, heart steady, faith stronger than fear. He remembered the Eucharist floating before him in silence and thought, "If you were there, you are here too." Minutes later, the parachutes deployed. The roar faded. A heavy stillness returned. For the first time in months, gravity called him back to the world he once thought he understood. When the hatch opened and sunlight poured in, he felt its warmth on his face and smiled. Every sound was louder now: the wind, the footsteps, the laughter of the recovery crew. Even the dust on his gloves felt sacred. He had seen the world from the heavens, and now every inch of it felt like holy ground. Later, when reporters asked what it was like to see Earth from above, his answer was quiet. You can't look at it and not believe there's a creator. When you see the world with no borders, no divisions, just beauty, you realize how small you are and how loved you must be. He didn't become a preacher or a missionary. He didn't trade science for faith. He simply learned that the two spoke the same language, one written in equations, the other in wonder. Both pointed to the same truth. Back on Earth, Hopkins returned to work, training for future missions. But those who met him noticed something different: a calm, a certainty, a peace that seemed to follow him wherever he went. He still spoke of trajectories and systems, but also of grace and purpose. He knew now that the same laws that hold planets in orbit also hold the human heart close to God. When he looked at the night sky, it no longer felt like a frontier. He had gone into space to study creation. He came back having met the Creator. For as long as humanity has looked to the heavens, there have been men and women who discovered that wonder leads not to pride, but to prayer. Science may reach for answers, but faith listens for meaning. When Hopkins looked out that window and saw Earth suspended in darkness, he felt what so many before him had felt: the unmistakable presence of purpose. He wasn't the first to sense it, and he won't be the last. Because there is a moment that comes to every seeker, scientist, artist, or believer, when the universe stops feeling like an accident and starts feeling like a message. It has happened in laboratories, in observatories, in hospital rooms, in battlefields, and in space. Places where the boundaries of knowledge meet the limits of human understanding. And in those moments, reason itself begins to whisper the oldest truth, that there is more. Centuries before Hopkins, there was Nicholas Steno, a Danish anatomist and pioneer of modern geology. He discovered the very laws that explain how the Earth was shaped, and yet, the more he studied, the more he saw the divine symmetry behind it. For him, the rock layers beneath our feet were not random, they were history written by the hand of God. He left science to become a priest, later a bishop, and finally, a saint in all but name. In another age, Blaise Pascal, the father of probability theory and one of the world's first great physicists, experienced a mystical night of fire, a vision of the living God that changed his life forever. He sewed the record of that vision into his coat, over his heart, so it would never leave him. His words still echo today. The heart has its reasons which reason does not know. In modern times, there was Dr. Alexis Carrel, a Nobel Prize-winning physician who witnessed a miraculous healing at Lourdes, a cure so sudden and complete that medicine had no explanation for it. He tried to resist belief, to rationalize it away, but he couldn't. That encounter led him to faith, and he spent the rest of his life reconciling science with the mystery of grace. And then there was Bill Lato, the environmental scientist who studied the Shroud of Turin, expecting to debunk it, only to be overwhelmed by what he saw. He called it a photograph of Jesus himself. His research led him not away from God, but directly back to him. These stories, scattered across time and fields of study, form a pattern, a constellation of souls illuminated by discovery. Each began with curiosity and ended with awe. Each started by asking how and found themselves face to face with why. For all their complexity, the great discoveries of science share one simple truth. The universe is intelligible. It is not chaos. It is order. It operates according to rules, patterns, and principles that can be described with astonishing precision. But behind that order lies a question. Why should the universe make sense at all? Every equation, every discovery, every constant that makes life possible carries a signature, a mark of intention. Even Albert Einstein, who wrestled with belief, once said, "The most incomprehensible thing about the universe is that it is comprehensible." To Hopkins, that sentence became more than philosophy. It was revelation. Faith does not ask the scientist to stop exploring. It asks him to look deeper beyond the data, beyond the measurable to the mystery that gives all things meaning. It invites him to see in the precision of an atom or the birth of a star not contradiction, but harmony, not coincidence, but communion. For every discovery whispers of design, and every law of nature hints at the lawgiver who wrote it into being. Even today, countless scientists, doctors, and engineers quietly find faith through their work. In hospital wards, where patients heal in ways medicine can't explain. In the hum of operating rooms, where a heartbeat returns after all hope seemed lost. In observatories, where galaxies bloom like flowers in the dark, each one stirring ancient awe. In laboratories, in classrooms, in mission control rooms, in the loneliness of space places built on reason, that nonetheless lead back to wonder. They rarely make headlines, but they are everywhere. A geneticist who marvels at the language of DNA and calls it the handwriting of God. A surgeon who pauses before every operation to whisper, "Lord, guide my hands." An astrophysicist who studies dark matter and admits, "The deeper I go, the more light I find." A physicist who spends his life chasing the smallest particles and confesses that, at the end of every equation, there is still mystery. Each one testifies to the same truth. That discovery, when pursued with humility, leads not away from God, but toward Him. Science measures creation. Faith meets its creator. And the two, when united, reveal something neither could alone. They are not rivals, but reflections, two mirrors facing each other, multiplying light until the whole room is illuminated. Michael Hopkins returned to Earth, but he never really came back the same. The silence of space had changed him. He once said that from orbit, you can't see borders or flags, only a single planet, fragile and luminous, held together by invisible laws. That vision still lives within him, and in every person who dares to look beyond themselves. For the modern world, his story is a reminder that truth is not divided, that logic and love, knowledge and faith are not enemies, they are two wings of the same ascent. One asks questions, the other receives answers. Together, they lift the human heart toward the infinite. They show us that intelligence is not opposed to reverence, and that understanding the universe does not diminish its wonder, it deepens it. There are thousands of stories like his untold, unseen, quietly unfolding in laboratories, universities, and ordinary homes around the world. Stories of people who reached the edge of human knowledge and realized that the horizon was not an end, but a door. Each one a small reflection of a larger truth, that the universe is not a riddle to be solved, but a relationship to be lived, that the deeper we look into creation, the more clearly we glimpse the face of its creator. The stars will always call us higher. We will always chase them not to escape Earth, but to understand heaven. And maybe that is the true purpose of science, not merely to explore creation, but to encounter the one who breathed life into it, to stand in awe before the infinite and realize that the same God who hung galaxies in the void also knows each of us by name. Hopkins once said, "The farther I went from Earth, the closer I felt to God." Perhaps that is what every soul discovers in its own way, whether through prayer, through art, or through the laws of physics, that every honest search for truth, wherever it begins, ends in the same light. So when we gaze at the stars tonight, let us remember what he saw up there: a world without borders, a silence that speaks, and a God who waits patiently in the space between every question and every answer. Because the greatest discoveries don't happen in space, or in a laboratory, or even in a church. They happen in the human heart, when wonder turns to worship and knowledge becomes love.